What often happens is a pastor leaves because a lot of these churches, they can't afford to pay well, so they stay 2 to 3 years. There's probably been 50 years of unintentional interims, and they hire an evangelical either because they didn't know who he was or they thought they'd try that flavor of the week for any of 100 reasons. And this guy gets there and he realizes he's in Mars.
Hello everyone, Dennis Allen with the Disciple Dilemma. What's going on in New England? The story sounds kind of ominous, especially when you think about the claim that 50% of churches there have walked away or rejected the gospel. Dr. Jim Harrell, who has founded Overseed Ministries, is with us today to talk about what's going on in New England and how is Overseed trying to help pastors and churches there recover the walk Christ called for each one of us as disciples. Here we go. Dr. Jim Harrell with Overseed, thank you very much for being with us on the Disciple Dilemma.
Well, thanks for having me. This is fun.
So I've looked at the brochures. We've had some conversation when we were together up in the New England area, but we need to unpack this for everybody. You've got this thing called Overseed. So for those of us who are walking in the door for the first time, what is that?
Well, Overseed was actually an idea from my wife. But the word picture is, as you think of, particularly in New England, as you think of your yard, it doesn't take long for the grass to get sparse, for things not to look so hot. And usually the answer is you need to overseed it. You need to put more grass seed down and slowly bring this thing to life. And in New England, if you think of the gospel seed, it's been sparse in many, many churches. And the pews are thin, and in many ways, the solution is we need to overseed these churches with the gospel again. So that's kind of the word picture that's behind it.
Why is New England struggling as a spiritual desert? Why isn't it flourishing? This is where it all started in the U.S., right?
Yeah, it did, and unfortunately, it's not. I think, obviously, it's a complicated thing, but I think you could look at it through two different lenses. One lens is over, the last 400 years or so, there has been a missional drift from disciple making more towards an inward focus and really towards preference. It has become more of a country club kind of feel to it. With that, there's also been a steady theological shift. And that actually goes in one of two directions. It either goes towards liberalism or it goes towards legalism. But both are a deviation from the gospel. And that results in a pretty deadly cocktail that ends up with what one group, Vita Church, calls the unholy trinity, which is idolatry, conflict, and abuse of power. And that just destroys a church. And so if you look at New England today, from the research I've done, there's about 7,500 churches in New England, at least that registered with the census. Of those, 50% have completely rejected the gospel. Another 30 to 40% are in some sort of deep need of revitalization, which means we're running on one cylinder in terms of healthy churches compared to what could be a tremendous gospel light that is unfortunately not happening.
So kind of door number one, door number two, missional shift, theological shift, facing a lot of these churches. Is this a result of the deconstruction of faith inside the seminaries, or is this the culture of New England creeping inside the doors of the church? How would you kind of set that up?
Well, unfortunately, if you go back and you look at the Harvards of the day, Dartmouth College, all of those were founded to train pastors in gospel ministry. And then Harvard, by the 1700s, had already rejected the Trinity, and it went downhill from there. So you have training that's not been great. It was further compounded by World War II. So at the end of World War II, anywhere between 30 and 70% of pulpits were empty, depending on the denomination. So there was this massive push to recruit guys into the ministry.
Mm.
At the same time, all the German liberalism was entering the mainline seminaries. And so we filled the void with untrained pastors who didn't know the Bible, didn't know the gospel. And because of culture, you could still keep the church going. But then as the culture drifts, people aren't coming anymore. And so you see a steady decline of attendance and the things that go with that. So it's kind of a both and. New England then has its own idiosyncrasies that makes ministry a little harder. But every culture has that. It's just there are some unique things to New England. They tend to be very resistant to change, and they love tradition. So don't change anything and let's keep it the way it always was. They tend to be very locally oriented. So one of the things that the researchers have found is a lot of the successful church plants in New England, if the pastor is not from New England, he tends to attract parishioners from wherever he's from. So if he's from the Midwest, you find the church has a lot of Midwesterners who have moved to Boston and so forth. And so the staunch New Englanders, if they go to church, which is a big if, they tend to go to more of the traditional white church on the green.
So you're describing a lot of vocational pastors coming aboard who have a very hollowed out view in terms of theology. Bultmann has gotten into their brains, or someone like that, right? Which has made them kind of a neutered asset in the pulpit.
Yes, and then you fast forward over the last 10 years and it's gone completely pagan. So it's not even really a neutered gospel, it's a different gospel.
Hmm.
And particularly in New England, they love that stuff.
We've got a pastor who's substantially ungospeled, under-discipled, or we've got a pastor who is deeply discipled saying, help. What's kind of the typical phone call for you?
What often happens is a pastor leaves because a lot of these churches, they can't afford to pay well. So they stay 2 to 3 years. There's probably been 50 years of unintentional interims. And they hire an evangelical either because they didn't know who he was or they thought they'd try that flavor of the week for any of 100 reasons. And this guy gets there and he realizes he's in Mars. And what do I do? And then somehow they find out about us. So the phone call's usually from the pastor saying, I hear you help guys in this situation. Could we have a conversation? The other way it happens is we've realized, like for me to go do a Saturday seminar in a church that is in deep need of revitalization, it's not going to do anything. They might learn a few terms and a few things. It takes somebody who's going to stay there, love people, disciple people, but it's a 7 to 15-year process to turn around a typical church in New England. So what we spend a lot of time doing is coaching pastors so that, number one, they don't quit, because if they go 3 years in and quit, the church just goes backwards. So we help them to thrive in this odd scenario. It's a missionary calling. It's like going to France. If you went to France and nobody knew the gospel, you wouldn't be surprised. But if you walk into a church, you think they should know the gospel. Well, they don't. And so it kind of warps the way they need to think. But if they embrace that and they love people, and I mean, if you think about a church plant, you're trying to get people there. Well, in these churches, they're coming. They just have never heard the gospel. And so it's a long, slow, steady process where God does what only God can do, and that's he changed hearts.
You are describing in the corporate world what we call a culture change. It is at least 3 and probably 10 years to get a complete culture change. In fact, you almost have to graduate out a whole generational layer of atrophied, calloused people in a corporation who've said, I'm not buying into thinking differently. I want the unchange, not the change. So, okay, Jim, you're walking in the door with cohorts. Let's talk about overseas methodology. How do you do something to change a culture?
So what we do is we gather pastors together in local cohorts. I decided very early on we needed local coaching. Because even though New England is very different than the rest of the country, each New England state is very different from the others. And then even sections of the state are very different. So I could Skype with some guy in Northern Maine. I'd probably get 75% of it right. But if the key component is culture change, I'm going to miss it and I'm not going to be helpful. So we wanted local coaches who understood the dynamics of that culture. So we've got a network of about 25 coaches around New England. And then we just go out and invite pastors to a cohort saying, hey, can we help you? We'd love you to be a part of this. And it's a 5-year cohort, meets 3 hours once a month. And it's around 5 core competencies. So we want them to soak in one topic per year. So many pastors, they go to a conference, they get a great idea, but then life sucks them into it and it goes on the shelf and nothing happens. So we want them to spend a whole year. So we deal with 5 things. They're not rocket science. How do you lead your church? That's what we start with. And depending on the first thing we teach them is you got to figure out where you are. What is the starting point of this church? You know, where on the spectrum of all these things are you? We use various tools to do that. But so how do you lead your church? The second thing is, how do you make disciples? What is a disciple? What does it look like in your church to do this? How do you shepherd your people? In many ways, how do you preach the gospel privately to people? And then leadership development, you got to build leaders. And then the 5th year, we work on preaching, because if they're a brand new pastor, now they've been preaching for 4 years, let's help you get better, because that's a key component. If you're not communicating well on Sunday, you've really shot yourself in the foot.
How many of the pastors that you work with would you suspect were discipled in their early years and their seminary years, and how many of them have never encountered discipleship before?
Probably the majority have not had any kind of formal discipleship where somebody took them aside and said, hey, let me help you. You know, unless they've come out of the parachurch, you know, either in college or something like that. Usually that's where people have gotten it, or they were in a unique church that understood it. But I would say most of the time, so the first thing we do when we get to the year on discipleship is we just ask them, you know, what's a disciple? And it's vague at best. So that's where we start. Okay, let's define one.
You know, what would you suspect the percentage would be among pastors who actually have someone in their life other than their spouse who really knows them, gets them, and is walking alongside them when you meet them? How rich is that population, and how sparse is that population?
I would say it's gotten better in New England in the last 5 years. There's a number of pastor groups that are much more around relationship, around accountability. And so I do sense there's more friendships among pastors than there probably has been in a long time. These guys, especially the younger pastors, tend to seek it out. Could it be better? For sure.
I think about how cultures are very different, and in some ways how cultures are very similar, because in one respect, the way you're describing the New England culture has a very eerie echo to the same sorts of things that we see in the southeastern United States, which is we don't like change. And if you ain't from around here, we're not sure we like you. I think R.C. Sproul's joke was, I think there may only be 2 Christians left in the world, and I'm not really sure sometimes about my wife, right? Yes. So I think about how there are these similarities, but one of the significant things that we're seeing as we watch some of the spectacular fails in the church, I think about what went on with the Hillsong Church. I think about what happened with the Ravi Zacharias ministries. I think about the tragedies and trauma of the Southern Baptist Convention lately. I think about the stuff that went on at Conocook Camp. And the common denominators that keep popping up are leaders have no one alongside them who really know them and are in their lives well enough to be able to look at each other and go, Dennis, something's not right with you, or congratulations, Dennis, I think you're running the race well here. You're encouraged that you're seeing a little more support in that area now.
Yes, I think there's a lot of room for improvement. Paul Tripp recently wrote a book about how do you develop that kind of community among your leaders. And so I would say there was none, and now we've made progress. Is how many are actually having someone who's asking the hard questions? I don't have a finger on that, but my guess is it's a smaller subset. One of the things that you find is that pastors tend to be hesitant to criticize other pastors, and rightfully so, because they understand how hard the job is. They understand, where else do you get to get up and speak every week where some subset of the people are mad at you? It's just a hard job. So they don't want to add to that. And so when we recruit coaches, we want a posture that says, hey, we're here to ask questions. We're here to dialogue. We're here to help these pastors think about church in their context. But at the same point, they also are sinners. They also have blind spots. They also need someone to speak into their life. And so I want our coaches to be willing to be Bill Belichick and say, that's not how you tackle. Now, if you did it every week, every minute, everybody quit, but there has to be a mindset that says, I'm here to help you walk in light of the gospel. And if we truly believe the gospel affects everything, then it affects the way we think about ministry. It affects the way we shepherd people. It affects the way we treat our wife. And we all have blind spots where we say we believe the gospel, but we're not really living out the gospel. And so we need each other to come alongside and say, what are you doing? Or let me ask you a few questions about that. Especially younger guys, I don't know what it is. They're always drawn to the solution that's going to blow everything up. And you don't want to say that, but just say, hey, let me give you some other ideas, or here might be an unintended consequence. Because I think young guys are drawn to power solutions. And usually power in the church just doesn't end up well.
I like the way you delicately handle that. Folks, as we talk about this conversation with Jim, there are some people who might find themselves hurt, offended, or frustrated because we're talking about churches and pastors. And while it may not be any of the folks in New England who are cheerily in many ways not too concerned about all that sort of thing, we do get traffic from time to time about, oh my gosh, you guys are too hard. This is not a criticism of the church. This is not in any way a criticism of the pastors. Jim's world and his work in Christ is renovation, revitalization of the church in the ways that Christ would have it to be renovated and revitalized. So I'm just wondering, what kind of criticism do you get, Jim? What do you hear from people listening to what you're up to and they have thoughts about Overseed?
I would say, the trouble we have is I want to cover too much ground too fast. And the complaint that I get from my coaches is it's too much material to cover in 3 hours. And I'm like, yeah, I know. So just cover what you can. I want you to have more than you need. But that's the most common problem I have is I just want these guys to grow and become who Jesus wants them to be faster than sanctification typically allows.
I'm going to put you into Shark Tank for a minute here, and I'm going to give you the really unfair assignment. There are pastors around the U.S., not necessarily in your neighborhood, who, as you have described up there, are living very challenging lives. There is a lot of despair, frustration, fatigue, burnout. What would your advice be now with your time and experience in Overseed as you take a minute or so to talk to pastors listening to this podcast? What would you want to say to them if you could have this one-on-one with them here?
Well, I'd probably ask a lot of questions, but what I would want to say is you have the best job in the universe because you get a front row seat at what God is doing in a particular place that nobody else gets to see. And half the time you can't even tell anybody because it's confidential. In other words, you are the voice in the hands of Jesus in a way that nobody else gets to do. And it's hard, it's tiring, but it's really worth it.
So, folks, welcome back to the Disciple Dilemma. We're talking to Dr. Jim Harrell, who is the founder of Overseed Ministries in New England, where he's helping to revitalize churches. I first met Jim up in the New England area at Gordon College for lunch. And Jim, in his kind way, walked up and said, you know, I got to look at that book that you wrote. And in some ways you gave me kind of, what should I use here for adjectives, Jim? It really kind of made you uncomfortable with some things, right?
It did. A little minor PTSD.
We really do want to have an honest conversation about the way we communicate, the issues we communicate, and getting better at what we're up to. So I get the privilege of having Dr. Jim Harrell, who's a Gordon Conwell, really cool guy. Please help us improve what we're talking about, the Disciple Dilemma. Tell folks, first of all, very honestly, what are some of the things that kind of bugged you or troubled you when you got to look at it?
Well, first off, I want to say I did like the book. I think the issue you're raising is without a doubt the key issue the church has to deal with. But I would say it's probably been the key issue the church has to deal with since it started. So a couple of things, I kind of feel like things were drawn with too sharp a line. Like it has to be this way. So when I think about the definition of a disciple, of course, everything I have, I stole from someone else. There's a group up, Praxis, but he uses the term irreducible core, which is the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. You got to love God, you have to be in community and love people, and you have to be on mission. And that's for everybody. I feel like when we start talking about discipleship, and it wasn't just your book, I find this a lot in dealing with pastors, that we munge leadership development and disciple making into one term. And I think that causes confusion because discipleship is for everyone, you know, from cradle to grave. I don't care if you're the 90-year-old grandmother, you're a teenager, you need to keep growing as a disciple of Christ. Leadership development requires a certain character, calling, and gifting. And that's a narrower subgroup. And so if we're talking about leadership development, but we call it disciple making, then there's a whole nother set of people with different gifting that I'm saying, you don't matter. You're not important to us. And that's what I saw in the collegiate group that I grew up in. I happened to have that gifting, so I was valued. I was the up and coming star. But the more I got around it, as I looked at other people, like they were just kind of, there are other groups for you, or there are other places for you. They weren't valued. And so when I think we talk about disciple making, I personally don't, I feel like disciple making is a team sport. It's not a one-on-one thing. I don't think in 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul was saying that every individual is to go follow 2 Timothy 2:2. I think leaders are, and I think pastors are, but generally it's a team sport, and it takes all of that gifting to build community and to build disciples. So I felt like that distinction wasn't clear, and I may have missed it.
No, I like the way you're setting that up. I think that a similar sort of situation, which will lead me back around to what you've just said, which I thought was quite good. A similar sort of situation is there are a lot of monolithic views in Christianity that everybody is an evangelist. We are all evangelists, when I think the conversation in Galatians is quite clear that some of you have that gift and some of you don't have that gift. And so therefore, you know, we should all be evangelical, but we are not all evangelists. Similarly, I love the way you just said this, and I wish I could have stolen that from you a lot earlier and used it, which is we expect our leaders to be disciples and discipling, but we do not expect them to be the reason for the core of the hub of the only ones who are discipling. And that, to me, kind of raises the point that you were talking about earlier with Overseed. We're trying to make sure that pastors are in a disciple's mindset, but also that everybody in the pews realizes this job description's on you too. I think that's what I just heard you say.
Yes, but not individualized. So
Unpack that for me just a little bit, so I'm sure I'm with you on that.
yeah, so I think in America, when we say make a disciple, we're thinking one to one to one to one to one.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's more leadership development. I think disciple making is like in a small group where you have somebody who's making the meal, someone who's hosting the house, someone with the gift of hospitality, someone with the gift of mercy, someone with the gift of leading, that together they're making disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's in the context of community where all the gifts are of value.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
if we individualize it, what we tend to do is say, you hospitality people, yeah, nice to have you here, but you're really not that value
You're a
added.
lower class of disciple.
Right. When we talk about the mission, yeah, you know. And I've just seen that so many times, and it ends up being so hurtful because most people don't have the gift of leadership. Most of them have hospitality and service. And when you look at the typical church gift mix, that's where they are. But a good leader can take all those gifts and see discipleship happening.
Yeah, I like that. So let me just kind of traffic that for a moment too. When we talk about the idea of leadership, I tend to think more in terms of, okay, this is a small group leader or an elder or a pastor. That's kind of in that category. How would you respond to the question? And I want to frame this, and I'm speaking to a theologian, so this is really scary, but I'll try it. When we see Jesus talking about go make disciples, the concept's really more about progress one another. It's a progression of all of us, not simply, go convert people into super women and super men. When I think about that, the question that I would tee up for you is, are we not all, each one of us individually, responsible for remembering that the make is as much on each one of us as it is also on the pastor? How would you play with that little word salad?
Yes, but I would say the make is on the church.
Okay.
And so if you go to like Ephesians 4, he gave some to equip the saints. So those that are the equippers are the ones that are really developing leaders and developing people with that kind of gift, character, calling, who are going to have, in a sense, the biggest ministry impact in terms of numbers. But they're to equip the saints to do the work of service, which in the end results in people loving one another. So I think what we want people to say is, whatever my gift is, am I using that for the church to be able to make disciples? So if I have the gift of hospitality, it's not simply, do I have a nice home, but is my home being used so that when all the gifts are together, that people are becoming more and more like Jesus, or they're coming to Jesus?
What do you think the headwinds are, facing the Western Christian community when it comes to discipleship? What are the things that are holding us back and pushing us down from a biblical grasp of what Christ wants us to be as disciples?
I think at the bottom of it all is we really have jettisoned the gospel. We're not really, we come Sunday and mostly we pick a church that meets our preference. We don't really want to be too challenged in the message, and we've kind of done our thing rather than realizing Jesus said, hey, I want you to take up your cross and follow me. That the gospel is about, how do I live by faith in the promises of God rather than the promises of America or the promises of culture? And if I look at Colossians 2, it says we come to Christ by faith, and then we're to grow in Christ by faith. So I would say all salvation, justification, and sanctification is always the result of faith. And so are we like in Hebrews, are we encouraging one another as long as it's called today to believe the promises of God as they particular apply to my life today? And I don't hear that kind of dialogue going on a lot, asking people, what is God doing that you're trusting in this week? Or what is the sin that you're fighting because you really see it's a false promise and it keeps suckering you in, but you realize it's a false promise, that it's a lie. I think that's one of the headwinds, that the gospel is assumed. You need it to come to Christ, but then it's really not needed after that, and it becomes assumed, and then it doesn't become transformative. And a pastor's got 30 minutes a Sunday, but if he's not clear that that's what he's trying to do, is replace the lies of Satan with a promise from this particular passage that draws me into Jesus, he's going to even have a harder problem.
I noticed that a lot of churches that we converse with leadership about discipleship come back to the idea, well, if we can just form small groups of 10 to 12, we can solve this problem. I'm just wondering about the idea of this life you've just described. Is that a life generally that needs to have one or two close aboard, or are you more of a fan of, hey, get a 10 to 12 and it'll all work out? How do you construct a conversation with a person in the pew about a discipled life? Do I need to pair up with somebody, or can I just show up 1.7 times a month and catch your sermon?
Well, not the latter. It's contextual. And I think it's contextual in terms of season of life. I think it's contextual in terms of, is this small town? Is this big town? I think a lot of things play into it. I think the question is, am I, as a disciple of Jesus, do I look more like Jesus this year than I did last year? And if I don't, okay, that's a problem. And then what am I going to do to fix that? Now, that's from the bottom up. From the top down, I think the question is more, okay, if this is my definition of a disciple, someone just wrote a book real recently called Mind the Gap, which is, he's asking the question, what does it actually look like? So if I say my definition of disciple is I love God more, okay, well, what are some expressions of that? And then how do I begin to measure that as a leader, as opposed to attendance or budgets? Those things don't really tell us a lot. But are my people starting to look more like Jesus? And if they're not, then I've got to think through, okay, what are the methods that are going to work here? And sometimes it's triads. If we look at like replicate.org, they got a tremendous process for that. Sometimes it's small group, although we know historically, you look at the Willow Creek research, they had a ton of small groups, didn't do much. I've seen my own small groups, some yes, some no. So I don't think there's a magic formula, but there's only so many practical options available. And I think we ought to use every one of them to the extent that we can. But somehow tracking, is it actually producing the fruit that we're looking for? And if it's not, then maybe we need a different method.
Dr. Jim Harrell with Overseed Ministries, you have founded this group. You're working in New England area to revitalize churches. Thank you for what you're doing out there.
Well, it's been a gift to be able to do this. Nothing I ever set out to do, but God has been kind to allow us to have a small part in what he's doing up here.
Tell us how folks can invade your space and learn about what you're up to. Give us some connectivity on websites and what we can do to reach out and learn more about what you're doing at Overseed.
Just overseed.org is our website. My email and contact information is all up there. It's just jim@overseed.org. And if there's any way that we can be helpful, we'd love to be able to do that.
Folks, you're seeing the picture of the Overseed website right now and the web address. And in all that, you also see a lot of the traffic on cohorts, programs, things that they're up to at Overseed. So, Jim, Harrell, thank you for being with us today on the Disciple Dilemma.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on today's podcast. Would you help us get the word out about discipleship in the Western Christian world? We think it's been hacked. We think we've walked away from the model Christ gave us. Join us on our website, www.thediscipledilemma.com, or YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or the RSS feeds. We're all under the Disciple Dilemma there. Follow us. Help us get the word out. We want to get back to the model of discipleship Jesus gave us. And as always, thanks for listening.